My daughter begged me not to go on a business trip. Daddy, something bad happens when you are gone. I canceled the trip. Told no one. That night, I hid in the basement. At 11 p.m., my mother-in-law arrived with two men I'd never seen. They walked toward my daughter's room. I stepped out of the shadows. They tried to run, but someone was waiting for them at the door. It sounds like a nightmare, but for me, it was Tuesday. The warning signs were there long before the violence started. 6 hours earlier, the house felt suffocatingly quiet. I was packing a suitcase on the bed, folding shirts with military precision, while my wife Vanessa stood in the doorway. She wasn't helping. She wasn't even really watching me. She was staring at the clock on the wall, her foot tapping a frantic, silent rhythm against the hardwood. There was no sadness in her eyes about my departure, only a thinly veiled anticipation. It was the look of someone waiting for an obstacle to finally remove itself. Then came the grip on my wrist, small but desperate. My 7-year-old, Lily, had snuck into the room, her eyes wide and glossy with unshed tears. She didn't just ask me to stay. She pleaded with a visceral terror no child should understand. Her fingernails dug into my skin, leaving white crescents as she whispered her warning. It wasn't a tantrum. It was instinct. That specific frequency of fear triggered something deep in my brain, waking up a part of me I thought I'd buried in the desert. I finished zipping the bag, but my decision was made. I walked downstairs, playing the role of the oblivious husband. Vanessa met me in the foyer. She didn't offer a kiss, just a tight, forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Drive safe," she said, practically opening the door for me. She was ushering me out like an unwanted guest. I tossed my bag in the trunk, started the engine, and watched her lock the front door. The second I pulled out of the driveway, I drove 3 blocks, turned left, and killed the headlights. The neighborhood was settling into its evening rhythm, oblivious to the predator circling back. I parked behind an abandoned foreclosure that offered a clear line of sight to my backyard. My hands weren't shaking. For the first time in years, the static in my head cleared. The dull numbness of suburban life evaporated, replaced by cold clarity. I wasn't an architect anymore. I was a hunter again. And my territory had just been breached. Returning on foot took 10 minutes of careful movement through shadows. I avoided the motion sensors I had installed myself, slipping through the neighbor's hedge to reach the bulkhead doors of my basement. They were rusty, but I kept the hinges oiled. I lowered myself into the darkness beneath my home, the air smelling of damp concrete and old secrets. Upstairs, I heard the floorboards creak as my wife paced the kitchen. She thought she was alone, but she was trapped in a cage with a ghost. I moved to the corner where the old server rack hummed against the concrete wall. It was a relic from my contracting days, disguised as a breaker box to fool casual observers. I pulled the panel, my fingers remembering the code sequence, before my conscious mind did. A small monitor flickered to life, casting a sickly blue glow across the dusty floor. The silence upstairs was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic thud of Vanessa's heels. She wasn't pacing anymore. She was waiting. I connected my phone to the feed. The screen split into a quad view, revealing the skeleton of my life in high definition. The living room camera, hidden in a smoke detector, showed Vanessa pouring a glass of wine. Her hand shook so badly the red liquid sloshed onto the marble counter. She didn't wipe it up. That small negligence terrified me more than a gun. Vanessa was a perfectionist. If she didn't care about a stain on her pristine island, the world was ending. She checked her phone, the screen illuminating her pale, tight face. I tapped the audio icon, and the hiss of white noise resolved into clarity. The sound of her swallowing was loud in my earpiece. Her phone buzzed, a harsh vibration on the granite. She answered on the first ring, her voice cracking. "He's gone," she whispered, eyes darting toward the front door I had just walked out of. I watched him leave. "Yes, the coast is clear." The man on the other end laughed, a deep, distorted rumble. "Good. We're 10 minutes out. Have the package ready." The word, package, hit me like a physical blow to the sternum. In my line of work, packages were illicit drugs or stolen intel. Not people. Definitely not family. My stomach twisted into a cold knot. I watched Vanessa finish the wine in one long swallow, her throat working convulsively. She wasn't preparing for a lover. She was bracing herself for an execution or a sale. I checked the camera in the hallway. Lily's door was closed. The glow of her nightlight spilled underneath, a fragile barrier. I reached into the hollow space behind the server rack and pulled out the lockbox. The combination was Lily's birthday. Inside, the Glenavasig Saor P. 320 greeted me like an old, toxic friend. I checked the chamber, the metallic slide racking with a sound that felt too loud in the confined space. Upstairs, Vanessa moved to the front window, peeling back the sheer curtain. She was the lookout. I was the counter measure. I checked the suppressor, screwing it into place with slow, deliberate turns. Headlights swept across the front lawn, cutting through the darkness on my monitor. A black SUV idled at the curb, engine running but lights killed instantly. Vanessa unlocked the front door, her posture slumping in relief or defeat. Then I saw the figure emerge from the passenger side. It wasn't a stranger. It was Evelyn, my mother-in-law, stepping onto the pavement with the authority of a general. She wasn't visiting. She was commanding a squad. 2 large men followed her, and I realized this wasn't an affair. It was an extraction. Evelyn didn't knock. She swept into the foyer with a sense of ownership that made my skin crawl, the winter air clinging to her expensive fur coat. Vanessa stepped back, shrinking against the wall like a scolded child. Behind Evelyn, the 2 men filled the doorway, blocking out the porch light. They weren't wearing masks. Their faces were exposed, arrogant, and calm. This wasn't a robbery where anonymity mattered. They walked in like they owned the deed, shaking the snow off their boots onto the hardwood. I pulled my phone from my pocket, the screen dimmed to the lowest setting. My brother Cole was parked 3 streets over, waiting for the signal we had agreed upon years ago. I typed 2 words. Green light. The message sent instantly. I didn't wait for a reply. Cole would be moving before the pixels faded. I holstered the phone and gripped the cig. My heart rate was steady, a slow, heavy drum in my ears. I was calm, but it was the cold, dangerous calm of a predator. The audio feed crackled as Evelyn spoke, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Is she asleep?" she asked, not bothering with pleasantries. Vanessa nodded, her hands wringing together until the knuckles turned white. "She's out. I gave her the medicine like you said." The admission froze the blood in my veins. My wife hadn't just opened the door, she had drugged our daughter to make the handover easier. Evelyn smiled, a tight, predatory expression. "Good. The buyer is impatient. He pays a premium for quiet merchandise." I zoomed the camera on the taller man. He adjusted his cufflinks, looking around my living room with bored detachment. The resolution caught the shine of a gold lapel pin. I recognized it instantly. It was the city council seal. This wasn't a random thug. It was Councilman Sterling, a man who campaigned on family values. The betrayal deepened, sinking into my marrow. The law wasn't coming to save us. The law was standing in my living room, checking his watch, waiting to steal my child. "Let's get this over with," Sterling said, his voice deep and smooth, used to commanding rooms. "My driver is waiting." Evelyn gestured toward the hallway, her manicured nail pointing like a dagger toward Lily's bedroom. "Second door on the left. Wrap her in the blanket. I don't want any crying." The men moved, their heavy footsteps vibrating through the floor, joists above my head. I ripped the earpiece out. I didn't need the monitor anymore. The digital war was over. The kinetic war was about to begin. I moved to the basement stairs, counting their steps in my head. 1, 2, 3. They passed the kitchen. 4, 5. Entering the hallway, I eased the basement door open. I had oiled the hinges months ago. A habit Vanessa mocked as paranoia. Now, that silence was the difference between life and death. The darkness of the lower level clung to me as I ascended, a shadow rising to meet them. The air grew warmer as I neared the kitchen, smelling of Vanessa's perfume and imminent violence. I stepped onto the kitchen tile, my socks making no sound. Through the open archway I saw them. They were clustered outside Lily's door. Vanessa stood, the back, weeping silently, useless and broken. Evelyn was reaching for the handle, her greed practically radiating off her. Sterling and his muscle stood ready to grab the bundle. They were focused on the prize, blind to the threat behind them. I raised the weapon, lining up the sights on the bodyguard's knee. "Step away from the door," I said softly. The hallway air grew instantly static, charged with the sudden violence of my presence. All four heads snapped toward me, freezing in a tableau of guilt. Evelyn's face went slack, her aristocratic mask crumbling into genuine horror as she recognized the silhouette. Sterling looked annoyed rather than afraid, slept his eyes narrowing as he calculated the risk to his career. But the bodyguard was the only one who understood the physics of the moment. His hand dipped toward his jacket, a reflex honed by years of paid violence. I didn't give him the courtesy of a warning. I squeezed the trigger. The bullet shattered his right kneecap. The sound was wet and crunching, like stepping on a dry branch, magnified by the narrow corridor. He folded instantly, screaming a high, thin sound that tore through the house's stillness. He hit the floor hard, his gun skittering across the hardwood toward Lily's door. Sterling stumbled back, tripping over his own expensive Italian shoes, his composure vanishing. Vanessa screamed, hands flying to her mouth. But she didn't run to me. She didn't run to Lily. She threw herself over Evelyn, shielding the monster who orchestrated this. That choice was a knife in my gut. Sterling scrambled to his feet, eyes darting between the groaning bodyguard and the barrel of my gun. "Do you know who I am?" he shouted, his voice cracking with indignation. I didn't answer. I just shifted my aim to his chest. Self-preservation overrode his ego instantly. He turned and sprinted for the front door, abandoning his partners without a second glance. His footsteps thundered down the hall, desperate and clumsy against the floorboards. I didn't chase him. I didn't need to. I kept my weapon trained on the threat still in front of me, steady and unmoving. Evelyn pushed Vanessa aside with shocking strength, scrambling backward like a cornered rat. "He has a gun!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Vanessa, do something?" My wife looked up at me, mascara running in black streaks down her cheeks. "Hunter, please," she sobbed, holding her hands up in surrender. "It's not what it looks like. We can explain." The audacity took my breath away. They were selling our child like a used car, and she wanted to negotiate. I stepped over the writhing bodyguard, closing the distance until I loomed over them. A shift in movement caught my peripheral vision. The bodyguard, despite the ruin of his leg, was crawling toward his fallen weapon. He gritted his teeth, sweat popping on his forehead, driven by adrenaline or stupidity. I took 2 quick steps and kicked him hard. In the ribs. Air left his lungs in a wheezing whoosh, and he collapsed onto his back, gasping for oxygen. I kicked the gun down the hall, hearing it clatter into the kitchen. "Stay down," I commanded. He stared up at me, eyes glazing over with pain. He listened. I turned back to Evelyn. She was pressed against the wall, clutching her fur coat as if it could stop a bullet. "You are making a mistake," she hissed, her fear hardening into venom. "These people, they own the police. They own this city. You can't just shoot a councilman's staff." I leveled the cig at her forehead. The cold steel made her cross her eyes. "I am not the police, Evelyn," I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "I am the father." The realization of her mortality finally hit her, and she went silent. A heavy thud from the front of the house, followed by the sound of glass shattering. It was the distinct noise of a body hitting a solid oak door and bouncing off. Sterling's escape had ended abruptly. The front door groaned open, and heavy boots stomped into the foyer. "Hunter!" Cole's voice boomed, cheerful and terrifying. "I think you dropped something out here." I lowered my weapon slightly, keeping my eyes on Vanessa. The trap was sprung, the rats were caught, and the house was secure. But the night was far from over. Cole marched Sterling into the hallway, by the scruff of his cashmere coat. The councilman's nose was bleeding, a stark red contrast against his white shirt, and his eyes were wild with panic. He tried to speak, but Cole shoved him against the wall next to Evelyn, knocking the wind out of him. Found him trying to hotwire his own car. Cole grinned, hefting a tire iron. Keys must have fallen out when he ran. The foyer was now a holding cell. Blue and red lights washed over the living room walls, strobing through the front window. The sound of sirens cut abruptly, replaced by the heavy slam of car doors. I didn't holster my weapon until the first uniformed officer stepped through the open door, weapon drawn. It was Sergeant Miller, a man I played poker with on Tuesdays. His eyes widened as he took in the carnage. "Hunter?" he asked, lowering his gun slightly. "What the hell is this?" I didn't offer excuses. I walked to the kitchen island and picked up the hard drive I'd pulled from the server rack earlier. "It's all here, Miller," I said, handing it over. "Video, audio, conspiracy to traffic a minor. Attempted kidnapping." Miller looked from the groaning bodyguard to the cowering councilman. He signaled his partner. Sterling started shouting about immunity and entrapment, but the click of the handcuffs silenced him. The law was finally doing its job. Vanessa saw the officers moving toward her and crumbled. She dropped to her knees, grasping at the hem of my jeans. "Hunter, please," she wailed, her voice thick with manufactured hysteria. "My mother made me do it. She said they would kill you if I didn't agree. I was trying to save us." She looked up at me, eyes wide and pleading, trying to summon my sympathy. It was a performance, desperate and ugly. I pulled my phone out and tapped the screen. The audio file from 10 minutes ago played through the speaker, crisp and damning. "I gave her the medicine like you said. The buyer pays a premium for quiet merchandise." Vanessa's voice filled the room, stripping away her victimhood instantly. She froze, her mouth hanging open, the lie dying in her throat. Miller looked at her with pure disgust. "Get her up," he told the rookie. "Read her the rights." Evelyn didn't beg. As the cuffs bit into her wrists, she stared at me with cold, reptilian hate. She didn't look like a grandmother, she looked like a CEO watching a merger fail. You have no idea what you've started. She spat. Voice low enough for only me to hear. You think this ends with jail? We are just the middle management. I watched them drag her out into the snow. She held her head high, already planning her appeal. The house finally went quiet, leaving only the smell of gunpowder and fear. I walked to Lily's door and pushed it open, my heart hammering against my ribs. She was curled in a tight ball under her duvet, her breathing deep and heavy. Too heavy. I shook her shoulder gently, but she didn't stir. The medicine Vanessa mentioned wasn't just syrup. I brushed the hair from her face, realizing she had slept through the end of her family. 3 months of legal maneuvering had reduced the horror of that night to a stack of motions. I sat in the back of the courtroom, watching Evelyn's defense attorney pace before the judge. He wore a suit that cost more than my first car and spoke with a cadence designed to bore the jury into submission. He argued for house arrest, citing Evelyn's age and frail health, as if she hadn't orchestrated a kidnapping. Evelyn sat beside him, looking pale but composed, dabbing dry eyes with a tissue. She caught my eye and smirked. The judge, a tired man with a backlog of cases, seemed to be swaying toward leniency. He rubbed his temples, flipping through the medical reports Evelyn's team had fabricated. I could feel the heat rising in my collar, the same rage I felt in the hallway, but compressed into a dense, heavy ball in my gut. The system was designed to process criminals, not monsters. Monsters with money could buy their way into comfortable cages. I realized then that a guilty verdict wasn't enough. I didn't want justice. I wanted ruin. I walked out before the gavel fell, stepping into the biting wind of the courthouse steps. I pulled burner phone from my jacket pocket and dialed a number that didn't exist in any public directory. "It's Hunter," I said when the line clicked open. "I need the package we discussed." The voice on the other end was distorted, familiar only by its cadence. "It's ready. The drop is the parking garage on 4th. Blue sedan." I hung up and threw the phone into a trash can. The legal war was over. The dossier was thick, resting on the passenger seat of my truck, like a bomb waiting to detonate. I drove to a quiet overlook outside the city limits to read it. My contact had dug deep, bypassing banking firewalls and encrypted servers to find the rot at the core of Evelyn's empire. It wasn't just trafficking. She was laundering money for the Sinaloa cartel, skimming off the top to fund her lifestyle. She had debts she hadn't paid in partners, who didn't know she was stealing. This wasn't evidence. It was ammunition. I started with Vanessa. I logged into our joint accounts, the ones her lawyer hadn't frozen yet because he was incompetent. She had a separate savings account for emergencies, funded by her gambling winnings and allowances from Evelyn. I drained it. Every cent went into a trust for Lily, untouchable by the courts. Then I called the storage unit, where she kept her furs and jewelry. I authorized a liquidation sale. By the time her lawyer checked the balance, Vanessa wouldn't have enough money to buy a stick of gum at the commissary. Evelyn required a surgical strike. I opened my laptop and connected to a public Wi-Fi network 3 towns over. I uploaded the ledger of her skimming operations to a dark web forum frequented by cartel enforcers. It took less than 30 seconds. I didn't just expose her crimes to the police. I exposed her theft to the murderers she worked for. Her assets were seized by the feds within the hour. But the hit was already out. She was safer in prison than on the street. But I wasn't done yet. The next step was ensuring her cage was a nightmare. I contacted an old associate, who now worked as a corrections officer in the state intake facility. I didn't ask him to hurt her. I just asked to make sure her paperwork was filed correctly. Specifically, I ensured the protective custody box remained unchecked. Then, I forwarded the police report, the one detailing the sale of a 7-year-old, to the inmate processing clerk. In prison, child traffickers rank lower than rats. The general population would handle the sentencing. I returned to the courtroom the next day for the bail hearing ruling. The atmosphere had shifted. Evelyn's lawyer was whispering frantically into his phone, his face gray. Evelyn looked smaller, her confidence eroding as she sensed the sudden lack of insulation. The judge denied bail, citing new evidence of flight risk and federal RICO charges. As the bailiff moved to cuff her, Evelyn looked back at the gallery. She didn't smirk this time. She looked at me with the dawning realization of a trapped animal. She knew I had pulled the strings. Vanessa's turn came later that afternoon, via collect call I accepted just to hear the fear. "Hunter, my lawyer quit," she sobbed, her voice echoing tinny and distant. "He says the retainer bounced. They're moving me to the state pen." I sat in my kitchen, watching Lily draw in the living room, safe and oblivious. "That's unfortunate," I said, my voice flat. "You should ask your mother for a loan." I knew Evelyn's accounts were frozen. I knew Vanessa was defenseless. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, hard satisfaction. "You can't do this to me," Vanessa screamed, the desperation peaking. "I am your wife!" I looked at the divorce papers on the table. Already signed and notarized. "You ceased to be my wife when you opened the door for them," I said. "Now you're just inmate number 8940. I hung up the phone and blocked the number. The systemic dismantling was complete. They were broke, exposed, and heading into a concrete hell of my design. But as I watched Lily color, I realized the war wasn't quite over. I still had the councilman. Sterling was the last loose thread, the polished politician who thought immunity deals were party favors. I didn't touch him physically. I simply mailed a copy of the hard drive to his biggest rival and leaked the unredacted police report to the local press. Councilman caught in child trafficking sting ran on Sunday morning. By Monday afternoon, Sterling wasn't in custody. He was found in his garage with the engine running, unable to face the ruin I had orchestrated. It was a cowardly exit, but it cleared the board. Now, a year later, the silence is final. I sat in a diner across from the state penitentiary, stirring black coffee that had gone cold. The television mounted in the corner flashed a breaking news ticker. Inmate assault at women's correctional. They didn't name her, but the details were specific enough. A 60-year-old woman, hospitalized with severe facial trauma and broken ribs after an altercation in the yard. My contact inside had texted me earlier. The check cleared. The population collected. I watched the anchor describe the brutality with practiced neutrality. I felt a grim, heavy warmth in my chest. Justice wasn't blind, it just needed guidance. The visitor center smelled of bleach and industrial sadness. I passed through the metal detector without beeping, my keys and phone left in the truck. The guard at the desk recognized me, offering a sympathetic nod he saved for the victims' families. I didn't want his pity. I walked down the long, linoleum corridor, the fluorescing lights buzzing like trapped flies. I wasn't here for closure. I was here to make sure the lock was still tight. I sat behind the thick plexiglass partition, picked up the heavy black phone, and waited for the ghost of my wife to appear. Vanessa shuffled into the room, wearing a jumpsuit that hung off her frame like a sack. Her hair, once her vanity, was dull and chopped short to prevent grabbing in fights. She looked 20 years older, her skin sallow from lack of sun and poor nutrition. She sat down, refusing to meet my eyes at first. When she finally looked up, the emptiness there was staggering. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, animal fear. She picked up the receiver with trembling hands. "Hello, Hunter," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. "Did you bring pictures of Lily?" "No pictures," I said, my voice steady against the glass. "Lily doesn't remember you. She thinks her mother died in a car accident." It was a cruel lie, but a necessary mercy for a traumatized child. Vanessa flinched as if I'd slapped her. Tears welled in her eyes, but they felt performative, a reflex from a life spent manipulating. "I am up for parole review next month," she said. Shifting tactics. "The board needs a letter of support from the family. If you tell them I was coerced, if you tell them I am a victim." She let the sentence hang. She leaned closer to the glass, her breath fogging the surface. "I can't survive in here. Hunter, they know who my mother is. They know what we did. I get spit on in the cafeteria. I sleep with one eye open." She was begging for her life, trading on a marriage she had sold for gambling money. I looked at her hands, the nails bitten down to the quick. I remembered those hands mixing the sedative into Lily's juice. I remembered those hands opening the door to the monsters. "You aren't a victim, Vanessa," I said softly. "You were the gatekeeper." Vanessa's expression hardened, the sorrow evaporating instantly. "Fine," she hissed, the mask slipping completely. "Keep the brat. I never wanted her anyway. She was just an anchor dragging me down. Mom promised me $100 grand for her. Do you know what I could have done with that?" The confession hung in the air, toxic and absolute. It wasn't madness, it was pure, distilled selfishness. She hadn't been coerced. She had been eager. The last shred of guilt I felt for her imprisonment vanished, replaced by a profound, cleansing relief. I finally saw the stranger I had married. I stood up, the metal chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I already wrote the letter to the parole board," I told her. I detailed everything. The sedatives. The negotiation. The price tag you put on our daughter's head. Her eyes went wide, panic flooding back in. "I recommended they deny parole permanently. You're going to serve every day of that 12-year sentence." She slammed the receiver against the glass, screaming obscenities that the thick barrier muted into dull thuds. Guards moved in to restrain her. I didn't look back. I hung up the phone. Walking out into the sunlight felt like surfacing from deep water. The air was crisp, smelling of pine instead of disinfectant. I checked my phone. One missed call from the realtor. The old house was sold. The memories of that night were being painted over by a nice, young couple who didn't know about the blood in the hallway. I got into my truck and started the engine. The ghosts were locked in concrete cages behind me. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was the warden of their misery and the guardian of Lily's future. The balance was restored. The new house sits on a hill overlooking the valley, surrounded by a 6-foot privacy fence that looks decorative, but is reinforced with steel. I watched Lily from the porch swing, the rhythmic creak the only sound in the afternoon heat. She was chasing a butterfly, her laughter light and unburdened. The trauma of that night buried under layers of therapy and love. She didn't know about the prison visits, or that her mother was rotting in a cell. To her, we had simply moved on. But I was still watching the perimeter. For years, I believed the lie that my military service had ruined me for civilized life. I thought my hyper-vigilance was a sickness, a defect that needed to be medicated or suppressed to fit into suburbia. I was wrong. The sickness was the only thing that saved my daughter when the civilized world tried to sell her. I looked at my hands, resting on my knees. They weren't shaking. They were steady tools. I wasn't a broken man trying to be normal anymore. I was a weapon kept in its sheath. Daddy, look. Lily ran up to the porch, holding a smooth gray stone she'd found in the garden. It looks like a heart. I took the rock, turning it over in my fingers, feeling the sun, warm surface. It's beautiful, kiddo, I said, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She climbed onto the swing beside me, resting her head against my shoulder. She was getting taller, heavier, the baby fat melting away into the lanky frame of a girl growing up. She felt safe. That was my only job now. She went quiet for a moment, her finger tracing the pattern on the cushion. Do you think the bad people are ever coming back? She asked softly. It was the first time she'd mentioned them in months. The question wasn't fearful, just curious, like asking about a thunderstorm that had passed. I didn't lie to her this time. I didn't give her platitudes about police or laws or fairness. I pulled her closer, wrapping my arm around her shoulders like a shield. No, Lily. They aren't coming back. How do you know? She whispered, looking up at me with those serious brown eyes that used to be terrified. Because I made sure of it, I said, the truth vibrating in my chest. And because I'm always watching. She seemed satisfied with that, accepting my protection as an absolute fact of nature, like gravity. She hopped off the swing, the heavy moment passing as quickly as a cloud shadow. I am going to find another heart rock, she announced, sprinting back onto the grass. I watched her run, feeling a deep, ancient peace. Later that night, after tucking her in and checking the window locks twice, I went to my study. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk, bypassing the tax returns and bills. Beneath a false bottom lay the tablet connected to my new surveillance grid. The screens glowed green, showing the perimeter, the gate, and the road. Nothing was moving. I wasn't paranoid. I was prepared. I closed the drawer and turned off the lamp. The monsters were real, but they were afraid of the dark now. Because I was waiting there,